Good evening, I'm Terry McCarthy, I'm the President of the Academy. Delighted you could all join us tonight for our event with Masha Gessen. She's the John W. Kluge Distinguished Visitor. We're very honoured to have her. I love winners, and I'm delighted to say that Masha is not only a prize winner, but she's a double prize winner in 1 week. Because yesterday it was announced that she'd won the Christopher Hitchens Prize from the Atlantic magazine for her book. I guess it's for the last book, Future's History, right? They gave it to you for that. Just because of who you are. In that Christopher Hitchens kind of a way. Which, well, I'm not going to tell Christopher Hitchens stories, but she also won the Leipzig Book Fair Prize for European Understanding earlier this week. And so that's a double winner. We're delighted to have her. I also wanted to welcome Herr Landgrebe from Suhrkamp, who is over here, who published her book, and in fact, in German. And in fact, a number of her books are available outside in both English and German for purchase. So after she has spoken to us tonight, and we've had some question and answers, you can then further learn more from her books. Masha, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for coming, and we look forward to your talk.
Thank you. I don't know if I love winners, but that's an interesting way to be introduced. Okay. So I'm very, very jet lagged. So I have notes, and my latest book, The Future is History, How Totalitarianism Reclaimed Russia, which actually I gather has a slightly different subtitle in German, has just been published in a German translation. And the book follows the lives of 7 people, 4 of whom are born in 1984. Which was actually almost an accident, but kind of a fateful accident. So it is something of a coincidence that I'll talk a bit about George Orwell, and who doesn't get a lot of play in the book. I mentioned doublethink in the book, and I mentioned that to understand doublethink you have to engage in doublethink. But so I'll talk about him a little bit more now. And I'll talk about his essay, The Prevention of Literature, which I think belongs to the category of essays that are letters into the future. And I kind of feel like I'm responding to it from 2018. Orwell argues that totalitarianism makes literature impossible. By literature, he means all kinds of writing and prose, from imaginative fiction to political journalism. And he suggests that verse might slip through the cracks. He writes, too, that there is such a thing as, quote, groups of people who have adopted a totalitarian outlook, single truth communities of sorts, not just totalitarian regimes or entire countries. And these are deadly to literature as well. Orwell was writing in 1946, 5 or 7 years before scholarly works by Hannah Arendt on the one hand and Carl Friedrich on the other provided the definitions of totalitarianism that are still in use today. Orwell's own 1984, which provides the visceral understanding of totalitarianism that we still conjure up today, was a couple of years away. Orwell was in the process of imagining totalitarianism. He had, of course, never lived in a totalitarian society. He imagined 2 major traits of totalitarian society. One is lying, and the other is what he called schizophrenia. He wrote, "The organized lying practiced by totalitarian states is not, as it is sometimes claimed, a temporary expedient of the same nature as military deception. It is something integral to totalitarianism, something that would still continue, even if concentration camps and secret police forces had ceased to be necessary." The lying entailed constantly rewriting the past to accommodate the present. Quote, "This kind of thing happens everywhere," he wrote, "but is clearly likelier to lead to outright falsification in societies where only one option is permissible at any given moment. Totalitarianism demands, in fact, the continuous alteration of the past, and in the long run probably demands a disbelief in the very existence of objective truth." End quote. He goes on to imagine that, quote, "a totalitarian society which succeeded in perpetuating itself would probably set up a schizophrenic system of thought in which the laws of common sense held good in everyday life and in certain exact sciences, but could be disregarded by the politician, the historian, and the sociologist." Orwell was right. The totalitarian regime rests on lies because they are lies. The subject of the totalitarian regime must accept them not as truth, must not, in fact, believe them, but accept them both as lies and as the only available reality. She must believe nothing. Just as Orwell predicted, over time, the totalitarian regime destroys the very concept, the very possibility of truth. Arendt identified this as one of the effects of totalitarian propaganda. It makes everything conceivable because nothing is true. As for what he calls schizophrenia, this too has been borne out. As the longest-running totalitarian experiment in the world, the USSR neared what then appeared to have been its demise. A great sociologist named Yuri Levada and his team undertook a massive study of the resulting society. He concluded that the Soviet person's very self-concept depended on a constant negotiation of mutually exclusive perceptions. The Soviet person identified strongly with the great Soviet state and its grand experiment, and yet felt himself to be insignificant. He worshipped at the altar of modernity and progress, and yet lived in conditions of enforced poverty. Often deprived of modern conveniences that even the poor in the West had come to take for granted. He believed in egalitarianism and resented evident inequality, yet accepted the extreme hierarchical order and rigid class structure of Soviet society. To live in his world, simply to function day to day, balancing between mutually contradictory perceptions, the Soviet person had to engage in constant negotiations. In 1984, Orwell predicted this negotiation and named it doublethink. You will recall that even to understand the word doublethink involved the use of doublethink. Doublethink destroyed the mind and crushed the soul, and yet it was essential for survival. It killed as it saved, and that too is doublethink. But perhaps Orwell's most valuable observation in this essay concerns instability. Quote, "What is new in totalitarianism," he wrote, "is that its doctrines are not only unchallengeable, but also unstable. They have to be accepted on the pain of damnation, but on the other hand, they are always liable to be altered on a moment's notice." Orwell had observed the disfavor and disappearance of prominent Bolsheviks and the resulting adjustments to the official narratives of the revolution, the endlessly changing and vanishing commissars. Arendt argued that the instability was in fact the point and purpose of the purges. The power of the regime depended not so much on eliminating particular men at particular moments, but on the ability to eliminate any man at any moment. Survival depended on one's sensitivity to the ever-changing stories and one's ability to mold oneself to them. But why exactly did Orwell think all of this was so destructive to literature? He defined literature as a sort of conversation. Quote, "an attempt to influence the viewpoint of one's contemporaries by recording experience," end quote. He added that, quote, "there is no such thing as a genuinely non-political literature, and least of all in an age like our own, when fears, hatreds, and loyalties of a directly political kind are near the surface of everyone's consciousness. Even a single taboo can have an all-round crippling effect upon the mind, because there's always the danger that any thought which is freely followed up may lead to the forbidden thought. It follows that the atmosphere of totalitarianism is deadly to any kind of prose writer." End quote. Note that he is once again talking about the atmosphere of totalitarianism, the lived experience rather than the mechanics of it. It would follow that, as with the perpetual lie, this literature-deadening effect can outlast state terror. Of course, taboos exist everywhere, but Orwell notes that literature has sometimes flourished under despotic regimes. It is having to cater to the instability imposed by totalitarianism, having to constantly adjust one's worldview that is murderous to the writer, or at least to the writing. Orwell's assessment is based on his own intuition, but also on the observation that little literature of note came out of Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia. One might reasonably suspect, though, that censorship and fear were to blame, that better writing existed but had to be hidden. Certainly, Orwell could not have been aware of Anna Akhmatova's Requiem, a short cycle of poems about her son's confinement in the Gulag, or of Vasily Grossman's World War II novel Life and Fate, whose existence wasn't exposed until the 1970s. There was indeed a literature in hiding then, including poems whose manuscripts were destroyed almost as soon as they were written, committed to memory until a time when they could be made public. Some of this work is great, and this greatness might seem at first glance to undermine Orwell's point. But great works of literature are always a miracle, and they're usually dissonant with their environment, which might be what allows them to transcend time and, in translation, space. But I would venture that Orwell was not talking about the unpredictable business of producing masterpieces. What is lost under totalitarianism is good, and even good enough literature. These are the books that may be popular and even win awards before they're quickly forgotten. These are the books that pad the bestseller lists. The books that will seem quaint, outdated, or at best like curious documents of a bygone era in just a few decades. These are also the very books that facilitate conversation, that create mental public space, that influence the viewpoint of one's contemporaries. Without these books, politics, the discussion of how we inhabit a city or a country or a planet together, is impossible. Orwell suggests one more way in which totalitarianism kills writing. Serious prose, he writes, has to be composed in solitude. Totalitarianism, as Arendt famously wrote, eliminates the space between humans, turning them into one man of gigantic proportions. Separately, she spoke about the peculiar illusion of warmth and closeness that totalitarianism engenders. Totalitarian societies mobilize everyone. Supporters of the regime may be gathered in the big square, chanting their support for the leader, but opponents band together in tiny clumps that are always under siege, always in struggle to hold on to a patch of knowable truth. This is an honorable effort, but it is far from an imaginative exercise as anything can be. No one can imagine the future, or, for that matter, the present or the past, with their teeth clenched and their minds in singular focus. This leads me to the best-known line from this Orwell essay: "Imagination, like certain wild animals, will not breed in captivity." I want to zoom out a little to provide context for that famous phrase. This is a quote: "Literature is doomed if liberty of thought perishes." Not only is it doomed in any country which retains a totalitarian structure, but any writer who adopts the totalitarian outlook, who finds excuses for persecution and the falsification of reality, thereby destroys himself as a writer. Unless spontaneity enters at some point or another, literary creation is impossible, and language itself becomes something totally different from what is now. We may learn to separate from what is now. We may learn to separate literary creation from intellectual honesty. I think there's something missing. I'm sorry. At present, we know that the imagination, like certain wild animals, will not breed in captivity. It's remarkable that Orwell ends the essay on a note of some uncertainty. His lament for the possible, probable loss of the imagination is itself an exercise in the imagination. That is what makes this essay both a work of literature and a political work. We live in a time when intentional, systematic, destabilizing lying, totalitarian lying for the sake of lying, lying as a way to assert or capture political power, has become the dominant factor in public life in Russia, the United States, Great Britain, and many other countries in the world. When we engage with the lies, and engaging with these lies is unavoidable and even necessary, we forfeit the imagination. But the imagination is where democracy lives. We imagine the present and the past, and then we imagine the future. When the values, institutions, and most of what we hold dear about politics is under attack, which it most certainly is, we find ourselves fighting the good fight to preserve things just as they are. And this is the opposite of the imagination, the opposite of literature, and, I suspect, the opposite of democracy. Fighting to preserve things as they are inevitably becomes a battle to think and speak of things in certain ways, either defensively or preemptively. In trying to salvage the meaning of words as they pertain to the present, we keep words and concepts from evolving. Salvaged words quickly dry up and crack. Then they fail. We face the future empty-handed, language-wise. We're dumb in the face of the future. I've been struggling with this in my own work. Over this last year, I've been reporting from Detroit, and I have found myself, for example, looking at an architectural model of an urban farm. The perimeter of the model was made up of large, symbolically windowless gray buildings. These were the blocks that planners assumed would be bought, as so much of Detroit has been, and developed speculatively into faceless buildings that could be anywhere and belong nowhere. I know how to describe those buildings, and I have the language to describe what's happening in Detroit. I can write about the collapse of government and the vanishing faith in democracy. I can write about the disenfranchisement of the African American residents who make up 86% of the city. I can write about the homogenization and privatization of public space, complete with a private security force that has supplanted police in the neighborhoods of so-called revival, and about the private tram line for the gainfully employed residents of Detroit who happen to be mostly white. I can even write about what's not there. Houses that used to belong to families, schools, shops, music venues, the landscape of the life that used to be. I can write about the business of buying up and securing ruins, turning even unoccupied space into private space, preemptively. And I can write about a middle-aged African-American man who was wandering the streets of an apparently unfamiliar neighborhood, most of which was no longer there, looking for the building he was supposed to be guarding. It was his second day on the job at a private security firm. But how do I describe what was in the center of the architectural model? It was translucent, illuminated in pink here and there, light but not quite ephemeral. Made of plexiglass, this part of the model contained houses, trees, greenhouses, and other structures. Some of what was there was already there in the actual physical space depicted, and I had seen it. Some was not. It was functioning the way literature works, by depicting and augmenting, illuminating and imagining. But what was I looking at? I was looking at a kind of community, a sort of kinship, and a mode of cooperation. I was looking at economic arrangements that do not involve or involve very little wage labor. I was looking at an alternative to private property. For some of the participants, it was an alternative to the nuclear family. I was looking at something that appeared to exist parallel to capitalism. But I still had no words to describe what it was. All my words belonged to the world of the gray monoliths around the perimeter. Of the thing itself, I could say only what it was not. And yet I think this is the job of writers right now, to describe what we do not yet see, or what we see but cannot yet describe, which is a condition almost indistinguishable from not seeing. We must find a way to describe a world in which people are valued not for what they produce but for who they are, in which dignity is not a precarious state. Find a way to describe economic and social equality as a central value, a world in which inequality is therefore shrinking. Find a way to describe prosperity that is not linked to the accumulation of capital. Find a way to describe happiness as a public good and the current pervasive crisis of mental health in a way that doesn't involve the frames of norms and pathology or the language of fixing people. Find a way to describe a world without borders as we have known them, a world in which nation-states are not prized or assumed. Find a way to describe learning that doesn't involve the warehousing and disciplining of children. Find a way to describe justice whose objective is not retribution but restoration. Find a way to describe politics that are genuinely participatory, that reflect the complexity and diversity of human experience, that avoid the arbitrary divisions along party lines and emphasize cooperation around common goals. Find an ever more complicated and evolving way to write about gender. Find ways to describe kinship that is not the nuclear family or framed by the nuclear family. Find ways to tell the stories of friendship and community. Find ways to describe a humanity that protects this planet, itself, and other creatures that inhabit the earth together with us. Find words for reasonable and responsible cooperation. Find a way to describe public space that is genuinely public and accessible, and include in this the virtual space of social networks and other media. Above all, find a way to describe a world in which the way things are is not the way things have always been and will always be, in which imagination is not only operant but prized and nurtured. And find a way to describe many other things that are true but not seen, seen but not spoken. Orwell wrote that for the fiction writer, his subjective feelings were facts. Being compelled to falsify these feelings in a totalitarian atmosphere amounted to the prevention of literature. Orwell's perceptions of totalitarianism formed the basis for his novels, which in turn shape much of our current understanding of totalitarianism. I am proposing that subjective hopes are also, for the purpose of fiction writing, facts. These are the facts endangered by the fear and despair prevalent in our current politics. If one insists on writing the truth of those hopes, or rather if many writers do this, the result may not be great literature, which is always a miracle, but it will exercise the imagination. If it is good, or good enough, it will fuel conversation, and may it be half as prescient as 1984. Thank you.
I know you're working on some new ideas, and we can maybe move to that, but can we start with where you're coming from? The totalitarian part of what you were talking about? Because I'm not even sure, and we talked about this earlier. Let's start with this. Is Russia today a totalitarian state, in your mind? And you've gone through a lot of definitions and so on. Talk through that a little bit, if you would.
Sure, I just wrote 515 pages about it.
That's why I asked you.
So I don't think that Russia is a totalitarian state. I think that Russia is best described as a mafia state, which is a definition that's proposed by this wonderful Hungarian political scientist, a very witty Hungarian political scientist named Balint Magyar, who describes a mafia state as distinct from many ways in which Russia and similar regimes are often described as crony capitalism, or and I forget what other ways that Russia is described. But he points out that that it is not actually a question of voluntary associations, the way that crony capitalism would imply, that it is run by a patriarch who sits at the center of a family, that you can be born or adopted into the family, but you can't voluntarily join the family, nor can you voluntarily leave the family, which is actually very important to understanding why so many models created in the West don't apply to Russia. But what's also important about the Russian mafia state is that it was created on the ruins of a totalitarian society. And what I argue in the futurist history is that when that mafia state started to apply more pressure after the protests of 2011-2012, to secure its power and to perpetuate its power, society reacted by recreating the informal institutions of totalitarianism, because that's what it knew how to do. And so we have this bizarre situation where the lived experience of being in Russia now is the lived experience of inhabiting a totalitarian state in the absence of a totalitarian state.
So that's a somewhat bleak assessment in the sense that would suggest that what we're seeing perhaps also in Eastern Europe is also societies under some pressure going back to a system that they're familiar with, which in this case is pretty totalitarian too. Maybe not as extreme, but...
Maybe not as extreme, and maybe there are other forces at work. I mean, I'm a little hesitant to sort of generalize to other countries, especially without naming them. I think we get onto shaky ground. Because
I guess what I'm getting at here is there's a notion, and we talked about this, the American notion of the ratchet effect of democracy, that once you reach a democratic system, that you can't push the ratchet back, that you've arrived, it's Fukuyama's Hegelian notion of the end of history, and it has to be fine from now on. And that's, in your mind, not necessarily the case.
It's not just in my mind. I mean, it's like it's in... I mean, in Plato's mind, also not the case. I mean, for the most part, I think we don't actually expect democracy to last forever. And I would argue that we don't even know what we're talking about when we talk about democracy, and that we don't have and we shouldn't have a fixed definition of democracy.
So then to bring us to your work now, the next project you're working on, and you mentioned the work in Detroit, looking for some way that societies can reform themselves, looking forwards in perhaps different ways than we've grown up with, even in the United States. Talk a little bit about that, and not just Detroit, but the other cities you've been looking at, Medellin and so on, if you would.
So let me backtrack a little bit. I set out to write an entirely different book. I mean, I still don't exactly know what I'm writing, but I set out to write a book about how democracies, or what we think of as democracies, dismantle themselves. And I traveled around for a while, reporting, and it kind of wasn't coming together. But also for so many other people, it was coming together. So many other people were publishing books about how democracies dismantle themselves, and then I ended up doing a piece on this new Swedish political party that's based on a somewhat longer existing model of a Danish political party, called the Alternative in one country and the Initiative in the other country, and it's a political party without a platform. It's a process-based party that runs as a series of as an ongoing series of discussion groups that work out, facilitate discussion groups that work out proposed solutions to sort of listed crises in accordance with values that are set out. And the lists of crises and values are the only things that the party sort of keeps as fixed. And this ever-changing list of, or this ever-changing sort of fabric of ideas becomes the party's constantly changing platform, which they also try to hand out to other political parties, thereby sort of completely breaking with the idea of this vessel of a political party. And I wrote a piece about this party, and I realized I had so much fun writing this piece, and I was so much more interested in people who are engaged in the sort of this exercise of imagining a future than I am in, at this point, I think, a fairly well-described process of reaching for an imaginary past. That I started reporting this book that I'm reporting now on imaginative political projects. And so that's what I was trying to talk about in this talk. So, the problem with describing something that's either not quite there yet, or is there, but isn't described in terms that we understand, is that that's not normally what journalists do. Right? Journalists usually use the words of other people to tell you what you're seeing. And I'm faced with this problem of not quite knowing what I'm seeing and trying to describe it. So I'm still struggling with that.
But it's motivated by an anxiety that even our societies that we're comfortable with in the so-called Western democratic world are in somehow endangered, and that life could get a lot worse if we're not careful.
I like to think that writing is motivated more by curiosity than by anxiety, but I experience a lot of anxiety while engaging my curiosity. So, but yeah, I think that that the rise of demagogues all over the Western world that we're seeing is, and again, it's not that I think this has been fairly well described, starting with Erich Fromm, who proposed this idea of the imaginary past. Right? So we have someone like Trump running on this promise of a return to an imaginary past, a time when you were comfortable, a time when you weren't experiencing this overwhelming anxiety, a time when you didn't fear the future so much that it paralyzed you and made you want to destroy the present. And the way that most existing political parties, entities have tried to fight the rise of the appeal of the imaginary past is by proposing that the future, that the present is just great, which is evidently not true for most people, or this wouldn't be happening. And I'm arguing that to fight the appeal of the imaginary past, you have to create a vision of a glorious future. So that's my answer to your anxiety question. I think that the answer to anxiety is vision, and that's what I'm groping for.
So let me bounce back, if I may, to your last book. You basically follow four characters. There are other characters in the book. There are basically four characters: Masha, Jana, Suryosha, and Lyosha, right?
Very good.
And you start very early on, pretty much when they're born. And you're following them through a very critical part of Russian history. As you say, the 82, 84, they're born around that time. They experience Gorbachev, perestroika, the fall of the wall here, of course, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and some form of hopes for democracy, Yeltsin, and then today with Putin. Describe, if you could, the sort of the journey that they've gone through, because that's quite a roller coaster for anyone to go through in a short period of years.
So the reason that I centered the book on, the book actually has 7 characters. 4 of them are these cohort of people born in the mid-'80s, and they interest me because I've been obsessed for a while, and I was trying to free myself of this obsession by writing this book, with this condition of growing up in the 90s. And those of us who talk and write about Russia have talked a lot about the 90s, and have talked about the 90s in various ways, right? There's the sort of the dominant narrative of the 90s now as this time of chaos and fear and sort of darkness and rise of violence, which is true of the experience of many people, probably a majority of Russians. There's an alternative narrative that is true for a minority, which is that it was a time of exhilaration and opportunity and opening up and freedom and creation. And that's all true for people who were adults. But there were their children And I think that for children, it actually doesn't matter whether your parents are living through an exhilarating time, a time of invention, or a time of absolute horror and loss and fear, because actually your parents are living through a time of instability, which you as a child hate. And the alternative to that is found in Soviet propaganda, which was everywhere. It was on television. It was in children's books. It was in cartoons. It was, and it offered a kind of certainty and a kind of moral clarity and a kind of order that began this production of nostalgia in people who didn't really remember the Soviet Union. And I think that weird situation of the 1990s, the sort of the post-totalitarian 1990s that didn't get rid of totalitarian propaganda, holds the key to understanding a lot of what has happened in the 2000s. So that's why I was following those people, which is not exactly an answer to the question you asked.
But you start out with these four as they're literally growing up as little kids, and then they get involved in various ways in various political currents and countercurrents. One joins Pussy Riot. Two end up having to leave Russia. One loses her father, Boris Nemtsov. They had some optimism, I guess, at one point, but saw it, in many cases, cruelly sort of cut off.
When I was choosing people, I tried to write this book, and I wrote this book in a very strange way. So I set out to write it like a novel, so that you would either be inside these people's heads, or you would have a very sort of long distance, a very bird's eye view of things, where I would sort of explain how people have interpreted various events in history, which I think of as two distances that you don't usually see in nonfiction. In nonfiction, you usually stand about 2 feet from your character, and you know exactly where you stand and how you're looking at them. In a novel, you're usually either inside somebody's head or looking from a great distance. But this meant that I had to interview people about what was inside their heads, or what they imagined as having been inside their heads when they were children, or when they were teenagers, and when they were young adults. So not everybody has a high tolerance for this kind of interviewing process. And actually, funnily, this past summer, I was subjected to something that approximated this, and I realized I have absolutely no tolerance for it. I found it just unbearable when somebody tried to interview me in this way. So I'm extremely grateful to the people who are in the book for putting up with me for about 30 hours each. But this also meant that I didn't know what I was going to find. I had a working hypothesis, and I had my reasons for talking to these people, as opposed to other people, but I didn't know what they were going to tell me. And I was interviewing them more or less in parallel. And at a certain point, when we got to 2005, 2008, they all started saying this phrase, which in Russian is "будущего нет," there's no future. And I thought for the first time in my life, what kind of language has an actual phrase for "there's no future"? A language that holds this concept of an absent future. And that became very important for the book, and is even somewhat reflected in the title of the book. And that I think for each one of them, that moment, and each one of them spontaneously described to me a moment of sort of saying to themselves, "будущего нет." And that's the death of optimism.
You follow one of the through characters is this polling organization, the Levada polling organization. And there are some extraordinary discoveries there that the 5 greatest people in history. And the question, as I understand it, was posed not as greatest Russian people, the greatest people in history. Well, I won't put words in your mouth, but the results are quite astounding, and getting more pronounced as they go along.
Right. So it's one of those brilliant polling questions that people interpret as asking one thing, but that actually get at something entirely different, right? Which is that people think that they're being asked who's the greatest person who ever lived. But of course, the substance of the question is, what is your concept of greatness? Right? And it emerged very quickly after like a very short blip of sort of greatness being interpreted as maybe goodness and creativity and imagination and cosmopolitanism. Greatness became Russian aggression and dominance, right? With a small and understandable exception for Pushkin. So, who is just sort of a name synonymous with greatness, and as such doesn't count. But Stalin consistently has come out on top over I think the last 4 or 5 surveys. Putin is now in second place, post Ukraine. And there has been some fluctuation sort of in the lower 3 or 7, but basically it's become completely Russian, and it's all based in military domination.
So, is there no hope? And that's not meant to be a trivial question.
Okay, so I'm going to answer it as a trivial question, though.
For Russia,
so when I started doing publicity for this book in the States, sort of the day the book was published, I did a couple of radio shows, and the publicist from the publishing house was, I could see her sitting outside the studio and getting kind of long-faced, and when I came out of the studio, she said, could you not use the word hopeless or pessimistic? I'm like, well, what am I supposed to say? And she said, try fascinating.
I'm going to open up to questions. There's a lot of people here who know a lot about Russia. Who has some questions from the floor? Now, we're down a mic, so sir, could you shout out really loudly your question, please? At the back, yes.
Is it possible for democracy to what?
To be illiberal.
Is it possible for democracy to be liberal? I write about that a little bit in the book. All this, these attempts to define what exists in Russia and other countries as a kind of democracy, which I think betrays a basic betrayal of the concept of democracy, because in order to talk about an illiberal democracy, you have to understand democracy as a set of mechanisms, which I don't think it is. Democracy is a vision. It's an ideal that is never achieved. It's an aspiration. It's not something that can be established and then modified to be somehow different, right? So, an illiberal democracy suggests that democracy is having elections, and then you can have these elections in a reduced fashion and call it illiberal democracy, right? Or you can have elections, but have abridgment of individual freedoms, and then that's your illiberal democracy. But I think that to have that, you have to have a faulty definition of democracy in the first place.
Sure.
Yeah, actually I prepared a set of questions, but I'm going to ask the first one. They're more based in factual results that derive from what you write. So my first question would be, for example, in the German-Russian diaspora, that like you might be aware that there's like a huge population of German Russians in Germany, and they're all influenced by the Russian propaganda machine, the first channel mainly, and others, and thus they become resistant to actual facts and arguments outside of that filter bubble. My favorite example is, that gays are unnatural children-eating demons. Like that is like the status quo in Russia, in Russian thinking. And what strategies would you suggest on an individual level to change or break that way of thinking? Like, for me, it's a very personal question since I'm gay, and I would like my grandma not to think of me as a demon and be susceptible to like facts.
The simple answer to your question is that as a journalist, I don't actually suggest strategies. I try to describe things. Maybe things that don't exist, but still, I'm not. I think there are like other people whose job it is to suggest strategies, and who are probably much better at it than I am. That said, I think I'm a little puzzled by your question, because you're describing a group phenomenon that's very understandable, and that most people probably in this room have seen some version of that kind of group phenomenon. And then you're asking, what's the individual intervention against that group? No, I'm sorry. Can I? No, it's my turn.
Yeah, of course.
Yep. What's the individual intervention against that group phenomenon? And I think those are like completely different questions. Your individual intervention is your individual intervention. Talk to your grandma. That's that's how you do it.
Can I add something? I actually wrote down on an individual and societal level.
Yeah, no, there isn't an answer to it on a societal level. There is an answer to it on an individual level. I mean, minds are changed by one-on-one contact. They're not changed in a group dynamic, and you can't change the world view of a group of people. I'm convinced that you can't.
Let's go back there.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I have a question about your concept of your idea of truth being somehow endangered by totalitarianism. If I understand correctly, you describe totalitarianism as a danger to truth, but I see a little problem there, as especially the Soviet culture was so much focused on one single truth out there, prompting reactions that would question the concept of truth itself. So what do you think of this problem of the one objective truth as being part of totalitarianism, not part of fighting against totalitarianism?
I don't actually see a contradiction between what I said and what you said. I think we say more or less the same thing, right? So totalitarianism rests on creating the only possible option, the only available reality. That reality is maybe at odds with your experience of reality, and is probably at odds with your experience of reality, and is inherently unstable. And yet it is held up as the only objective truth at any given moment. And you don't have a shared experience of reality with your fellow human beings, because you have the shared reality that is divorced from your experience. And that's how totalitarianism functions. That make sense?
Yes, sir, you have your hand up there on the right. Yep. That's you, sir. Yeah. Yep. Oh, ma'am, so sorry, I can't see you from here. It was a man right in front of you. Sorry. No, you go ahead.
Have you ever been threatened in any way for your work?
I don't really know in what universe that question is appropriate. I'm sorry.
There's another hand at the back there.
Yeah, great lecture, thank you very much. I've got a question about literature and totalitarianism. And correct me if I'm wrong, you packed so much into this, is this literature in hiding? And imagination is where democracy lives. But when I was covering parts of the Soviet Union, and especially Poland and Romania in the late 1970s and 1980s, there was a literature in hiding. But that literature, without that literature, and even in the Soviet Union, Solzhenitsyn or Sakharov or others, or many, afterwards several others, without that hidden literature, through Samizdat or whatever, we would never have got this special insight into the totalitarian mind. And Hannah Arendt quoted on this as well. And so when I went back to talk to these writers after 1989, it was very curious the ambiguity they had towards the freedom. Because they saw totalitarianism as the enemy, and therefore they could write about it, and the expression of their creativity to explain this imaginative world of democracy which they couldn't attain. And when they got to democracy, the enemy was gone. And what I want to ask you is, do you find we have some great writers living here now, Sergei Levada, living in Norton, for instance, but do you find that the end of totalitarianism has not only, of course, liberated literature, but perhaps it may have dumbed down literature in the region?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, my sense of it is that the answer is complicated, but it's basically no. But it's complicated because I think that a lot of things are kind of subsumed in your question. What the people that you're talking about are, by definition, exceptional. And the work that you're talking about is exceptional. And the way that I read that essay of Orwell's is that he's actually talking about unexceptional literature. He's talking about the kind of literature, the kind of writing that creates context, that creates widely shared language, widely shared worldviews, not the the morsels of insight that are passed around among a select few. Right? However broad that group might have gotten by the time the Soviet Union collapsed, it was still a tiny, tiny minority, right? And it may not be great literature in the sense that we always understand it, but it was exceptional, right? It was always miraculous. It wasn't the soup that everyone can eat and exist in. And I think that actually I'd give a world for an existence in Russia of a wealth of good enough literature, right? That would create a kind of shared language and that would create a kind of widely shared worldview. So I think that like the dumbing down would actually be awesome. If there were a lot of somewhat dumber writing that was widely read, that would be a good outcome. I don't think that's what happened. I think that what happened was a crisis of purpose among the few exceptional people, right? And a shrinking, or a sense of a shrinking audience. I don't know if it's actually a shrinking audience for those few exceptional people.
Sir.
Thank you very much for the talk. It's very thought-provoking and moving, and I'm still trying to digest it. And I'm concerned I might have misunderstood some parts of it, so maybe you could help me in this process. My question is about your dichotomy between lies that are told in public by the bad guys, perhaps about the past, and imagination, which might happen in private by good guys, hopefully about the future. That's correct. And I'm just struggling with the dichotomy there. And there's all these quotes like, "The past is dangerously unpredictable," about Soviet Russia, or Joe Lie's mistranslated question about the French Revolution, it being too soon to tell. That made me think that this dichotomy isn't helping me with how we should remember the past. I'm thinking about, for instance, the Remembrance Sunday in Britain. There's this debate about the culture of remembrance, and also the future as something that we should share. I mean, ultimately, when you say, should we, take our private imaginations to the public sphere, is there a point at which they're melded into one to become a future we all move towards? Is that then also always going to be tinged with totalitarianism? These are the points I'd like you to... Sorry about that awful question.
Yeah, no, that's great. Okay, but I mean, you asked like 7 questions just now, so...
Pick one.
Right. So, no, I mean, is that imagination always tinged with totalitarianism? Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that's like, it's always lurking as a danger. If only we could clearly draw the border between sort of that moment of encapsulation when an idea becomes an ideology that becomes impermeable to argument or to challenge, and becomes a totalitarian ideology, right? If we knew where that border is, maybe we wouldn't be better off, but at least I'd have an easier time answering your question. But it's, yeah, I mean, every idea carries in it that risk. So a shared imagination is something that has to be constantly negotiated. The moment that negotiation stops is the moment that the danger kicks in, I think.
Thank you.
A quiet request. Somebody's phone keeps pinging. I don't know whose it is, but it'd be really nice if they could turn it off. Who's next? Yes, please.
I have a question regarding the interviews. You were speaking about the 30 hours interviews with the main characters in the book, and I was wondering, and while I'm reading it, I am wondering how much the fact that the memory is deceiving played a role in your putting it down into the book.
So no, that's a really good question. I have a specific, like an exact answer to it. So I decided from the start that I was interested in memory, right? Meaning not in reconstructing events as a consensus of different participants, but in how these people experience having lived through the events of their lives. I did. So I didn't do something that is part of normal journalistic practice, which is whenever a dialogue was recounted, I did not actually contact the other person in the dialogue to see how they remembered it. And I do mention it in the notes that what I was interested in was how these individuals perceived the events in their lives, right? So if that's how the conversation was remembered by that individual, then that's the conversation for the purposes of this story. I did encounter a problem just once. So I would check dates and events, and and mostly I could reconcile them, except once. There's one character who remembers something happening, 2 years before, 2 years after. I can't remember now, but it's in a footnote before it actually happened. And I had to footnote it. I mean, it's true for him, and since it's his life that I'm recounting, and I'm recounting it from a particular moment in time, which is the moment when the book was written, the year-long moment, then that's in the text. It's situated in the year that he remembers, and then in the footnote, I say that it actually happened 2 years earlier. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Sure.
In your talk, you mentioned very kindly the word poetry, and I'm wondering if
I said it would slip through the cracks, so it slipped immediately. Yeah.
tiny cracks. Yeah. So I'm wondering if that meant you believe or think that perhaps as a work veers or moves toward the more abstract, it is less tangible to a totalitarian system and perhaps more interesting for the future. So music, theater, dance, visual arts that moves toward the abstract might have a higher survival quality or something.
I haven't thought of it that way. I haven't thought of it as in terms of the abstract. I have thought of it in terms of language and totalitarian control over language, which I think poetry is actually better situated to challenge and also to repair language after totalitarianism. I think that and to be very specific about it, I went back to Russia in the 90s after working as an American journalist and started working in Russian as well as in English, and I realized how much harder it was to write in Russian because the language had been so discredited and so damaged by totalitarian abuse. Right? So many words weren't available to me. Entire registers of the language weren't available to me because they were suspect, because they're registers that had been the domain of the regime. And I think that poetry is perhaps better suited to weaving through, in between those limitations than narrative prose.
Poetry offers multiple interpretations. Poetry offers the mind varying truths or possibilities, as the abstract or music, what they used to call the avant-garde, all these things do in a certain sense. And maybe that's where their power lies in society, that they're not just so subliminally interesting. Maybe that's a power.
Yes, please.
Thanks. It was very inspiration to listen to you, and I was thinking about Victor Klemperer, who wrote literary tertiary imperi, because he wrote the diaries during the Nazi time and after, and the establishing of the GDR, and also to read that book, I realized how much Nazi words I use. Mm-hmm. Not knowing, so it repairs in retrospect the knowledge about a certain language. Right. Just
That's really interesting. I mean, I've read his books, but I don't speak German, so I don't have that experience. Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. Thank you.
But to look at the new book you're working on now, I mean, most people would think that we live in a democracy, that democracy might be in crisis or it is in danger. But you said earlier that you basically see democracy as a vision. I mean, you see as something we're moving towards and not something that has been achieved and is now in crisis. What do you think, I mean, how have we moved far back from achieving that goal, and many of the things that we feel to be elementary to democracy, like representative democracy, for instance, you see as basically a weakness. as something that at least doesn't function or doesn't actually represent many of the people in society.
So I think that that you can't think of democracy as a fixed goal, right? Democracy is a dream. Democracy is always an aspiration. If you think of democracy as a government of the people by the people, then it actually, if you think it through, it will always require a reinvention of both the ideas of the people and the governing, right? And it will require expanding both concepts endlessly. So it is always out of reach, right? So I think the question is, sort of, are we reaching for it? And I think that thinking of democracy as a set of mechanisms that is fixed and used is undemocratic. And that doesn't mean that those mechanisms cannot serve the cause of reaching for the dream. But thinking of those mechanisms as the definition of democracy doesn't serve the cause of reaching for the dream.
Can you talk about how the totalitarian model uses force, either internally or externally, to put an end to the excitements or the uncertainties? And you talk in your book about the us-them leader. I find that's an interesting way of looking at it. So we're talking about totalitarianism also as something that's fixed, which I think is closer to the truth, but also not exactly true. And I spend a lot of time in the book talking about evolving definitions of totalitarianism. Totalitarianism, as it was defined by Arendt and Friedrich Brzezinski in the early 50s, basically rests on ideology and terror. And I think that by the time we got to Václav Havel and now as we sort of look at what's happened in Russia in the 2000s, we realize increasingly that ideology doesn't play the role that we thought it played, and partly it's the passage of time, but partly it's also being able to look at the thing up close, because when something is looked at through text, which is what the scholars of the 1940s and 50s were doing, ideology always takes a privileged position because it's written down, and then there's the question of terror, right? There's no doubt, I think, that to establish a totalitarian state, you need terror. If I were to advise somebody on how to establish a totalitarian state, but as became clear by the 1960s and 70s, the memory of terror and the possibility of terror, the credible threat of violence and repression was enough. And now we find out that the memory of terror is enough. And perhaps we will find out, I'm afraid that we'll find out that the memory of terror will be enough. And so, although at this point there are more political prisoners in the narrow and hugely flawed definition of political prisoner in Russia today than there were at the end of the Soviet regime in 1987. In sheer numbers. So there's also the vector of this memory of terror, and then there's the other issue, which is I think what you're alluding to, which is the definition of totalitarianism as a mobilizational regime, right? So and that's a later definition of authoritarianism as an unpolitical regime, where basically the authoritarian leader wants everybody to stay home and tend to their private lives, while the authoritarian leader accumulates wealth and power, and nothing is political, and everyone is at home.
And the totalitarian leader wants everybody out of their home and into the public square to demonstrate their support for the for the totalitarian leader, and everything becomes political and nothing is private. And that mobilization requires a very strong and unstable idea of an enemy. So it's always an us versus them, but the enemy can can migrate. It's and part of part of being a totalitarian subject is keeping an eye and being very sensitive to this movable target of the enemy, right? So it's the gays today and the Ukrainians tomorrow, and the gay Ukrainians the day after, and you have to know which it is at any given moment.
But it suggests a certain tenacity there that, as you say, that the enemy can be unstable, can be changing, and that the system can adapt to that and almost needs it to kind of renew itself.
Instability is essential.
Yeah.
I mean, that's part of that's a defining feature of totalitarianism. Everybody's energy is sucked up by this instability because it's a matter of survival to know what the message is at any given moment.
Yes, please.
Living in Germany, it seems that part of the society's understanding of itself is that by having come to terms and been honest about the history, that it served as a sort of inoculation against certain forces of totalitarianism, and that it's part of the bedrock of democracy here. And I'd like to know, living in the United States, I mean, do you feel that a failure to live up to our own history there has been part of the erosion of democracy? I mean, how central is that aspect?
That was a really unexpected twist in that question, because I was all ready to answer the question about Russia, which, if you're interested, I have a very detailed answer, but the American question is much more complicated. I think that it's not more complicated. It's more subtle. It's the ability to have politics depends on having a shared imagination of the past, right? Which I think the Americans don't have. Right? Americans have widely disparate imaginations of the past, and that's and really peculiarly crude articulations of those imaginaries, and we periodically sort of see the conflicts of these visions of the past sort of flare up, but we don't even have an ongoing conversation about what the issues are that remain to be fought over about the past.
Let's have one more. I saw the hand go up there. The last question with the gentleman with the glasses there. Yeah.
On the way back?
Yes, please.
All right. Hi. Thank you. Do you think Putin has a good perception or a good understanding of the West, its concerns and its perceptions, or is that maybe irrelevant for actually how he formulates his own policy internally?
Could you
So
repeat that?
does Putin have a good understanding?
Sometimes I wonder if he maybe misperceives our intentions in the West, in certain nations.
So does Putin misperceive the intentions of the West, which suggests that there is an actual single correct interpretation, which suggests that there's a single correct interpretation of the intentions of the United States toward Russia. If I had that correct interpretation, I would share it with you now, but I don't. But I think there's actually an interesting answer to a question that doesn't have to do with criticizing the question, which is that Putin has been extremely effective at bringing the world into accordance with his own view of how it works. And that's sort of been the ultimate victory of the last couple of years, is that what Soviet propaganda and Soviet meddling in the West always wanted to do, Russian meddling has succeeded in doing. Not, I suspect, because it has become so much more sophisticated, but because somehow there has occurred a convergence of the way that Russia views the world, and the West actually works. And the way that Russia views the world is that everything is rotten. Democratic mechanisms are fundamentally corrupt. Everything is for sale. Nothing is true. And the worst will always win out. And that description, which fits contemporary Russia pretty well, is increasingly accurate when applied to Western countries. And the easiest thing to say about that is because the Russians did that. But I don't think the Russians did that. I think the Russians saw that, and a lot of Western societies have devolved to that point where there's a convergence there. How was that for fascinating?
So, I should say, Masha told me this morning that last year she wrote 100 pieces for The New Yorker, both online and in the magazine. Clearly an extremely curious mind with a lot of things to think about. So we thank you for sharing a bit of your thought process with us tonight. Thank you so much all for coming. And Masha, that was fantastic. Congratulations for your prizes.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Well done. Thank you.